Before I pressed record, we were talking about this off camera. So, if any of you watch the podcast on video, I'm usually wearing headphones. My co host is not. But basically, this got into a debate between the two of us of which we would prefer, headphones or earbuds, because you pulled out your crusty old earbuds that you had sitting somewhere on your desk to see if those would work. You said you prefer earbuds to headphones. I was the other way around. Explain your rationale for the audience real quick here.
Yeah, it's more of a just lightweight, easier to carry around type thing. I don't like having the big headphones on my entire head and just all of that, dealing with all of that, having to lug those around. I like being able to shove them in my pocket and just go from there. So it's more of an ease of access thing. But even if I were just sitting here in my living room, I would rather have the smaller earbuds, AirPods, whatever it is I'm using. I don't know that I can fully explain my rationale. I just know that it's my preference. So you can go ahead and explain your side of the deal if you'd like to.
Well, so I told you that my issue is I can't find a pair of earbuds that are both actually comfortable to wear and will actually stay in my ears. So I've probably blown through like 5 different pairs of earbuds on my journey to try to become an earbud guy because I get like the bulkiness thing with the headphones. I don't like lugging these around everywhere. And I am listening to, like, I'm a pretty big music guy, so I'm listening to music all the time. Or, if there's anything I'm doing where I don't need my speakers on in public. So I don't like lugging the headphones around, but every pair of earbuds that I've tried have either made my ears hurt, like really bad, or they are more comfortable and they just fall out of my ears really easily. So finally, after investing too much money in trying to find a good pair of earbuds, I settled on my $50 headphones that I can get years worth of mileage out of. So that's why I've settled where we have. But we'll get that out of the way for now. Welcome back to the Brewer Fanatic podcast. Happy Pitchers and Catchers Week. Brewers pitchers and catchers reporting for duty on Wednesday, the unofficial start of baseball season. Not the official start quite yet, but we do have a flurry of baseball news coming back now. There's going to be developments from Brewers camp, and we're going to talk about a couple of those developments this week on the Brewer Fanatic podcast. Thank you all for joining us again this week. That also means we're going to be back on our weekly release schedule as well, because there is going to be more action going on. Before we jump into spring training happenings, though, we have to quickly recap something that happened before the Brewers reported for spring training, and it was some good news. William Contreras and the Brewers, somewhat surprisingly, I think, to both of us, settling on a new contract for not only 2025, but also containing a club option for 2026. So the Brewers avoiding arbitration with William Contreras. If you had listened a few weeks ago, we had basically talked about this as if it was a done deal that these two sides were going to go to a hearing. I gave the whole long-winded explanation of why teams were going file and trial, just kind of the whole landscape of how players are compensated through arbitration, how that tends to favor teams, so why teams have been taking a hard line stance on that. But we got an exception here. And not only this, I had noticed too, even before these two sides came to this agreement, that there were other players who we had cited as similar cases to Contreras, in the sense that their teams were also seemingly about to go to a hearing with them over like a crazy small amount of money, or a seemingly small amount of money. But those teams agreed with those players too. I know Jarren Duran avoided arbitration. He was an example we cited. Kyle Tucker and the Cubs avoided arbitration.
Mm-hmm.
I believe the Dodgers and Alex Vesia did as well. That was another example we had cited. So our managing editor over at Brewer Fanatic, Matt Trueblood, actually kind of looked at all of this stuff, and made the case that teams are pivoting away now from the file and trial approach, which is interesting to me. But basically, this is not something we were expecting, because it is different from what we had seen both the Brewers and a lot of other teams do as well. And to me, it's still not quite the same as the Devin Williams thing, because, we talked about the amounts that Contreras had filed for, the kind of precedent that was set. So it was a little bit of a different case to me, and the fact that there just didn't seem to be a whole lot of room for a middle ground agreement without one side really giving up a lot of leverage compared to how they thought the system could benefit them. So I was shocked by it. Spencer, it sounded like you were pretty surprised as well.
Yeah, I could not believe it when I saw the notification come through. I can't remember who the first one to report that they had settled was, but I saw Mark Feinsand was the one who had reported the numbers first, and that was when it became, I think, even more of a surprise to me. In the end, like the number that they settled on for 2025 is $6 million. That makes sense. That's basically splitting it in the middle. The Brewers had filed at 5.6 million. Contreras had filed at 6.5. It's obviously not exactly down the middle, but it's pretty much right down the middle. I think the surprise comes in, you knew if this happened, you were probably going to see some sort of option for the next year. I mean, I think that was in my head. If this was going to happen at all, there was going to be some sort of benefit that the Brewers would get out of it by settling. But in the end, the 2026 number that came across as a club option is $12 million, which we're not going to rehash everything we've gone through with all the comparables and everything, but that would be by far the record for a second year of arbitration for a catcher by multiple millions of dollars. So I can't see the Brewers ending up picking up this option. There's $100,000 buyout, which, assuming they don't pick it up, means you're basically going to 6.1 million guaranteed for 2025. I guess my thing with this is I just don't get where the Brewers got any benefit out of this, because I think it would take like an MVP season for them to even really consider picking up this $12 million team option. That would probably be the only time they could look at it and say they might actually get good value out of it, which I can't completely rule out William having that season. I think we've talked about, like, if he starts hitting the ball in the air more, the sky's kind of the limit offensively. So I'm not going to rule out, this is a guy who's gotten MVP votes both seasons he's been with the Brewers, but it's still, it just feels like there's not a very high likelihood of the Brewers ending up picking up this option. So in the end, it just kind of feels like they settled, and that was all they did. Like, they didn't really get a benefit out of it. And, relationship wise, they might have gotten a benefit out of it and everything else that comes with that. Um, but it was a surprise to me for that reason, that I thought on the back end there would be something that, like, financially might help the Brewers down the line. And I don't see that. But there's also the possibility that as they started looking further into this case, as they were preparing for it, that they started feeling like, we might have a chance at not winning this case. And then, that could be a reason to potentially say, let's settle this. Let's keep the good relationship and not go to court, argue against them, and then not even get the financial benefit of winning the case in the end. So who knows what the actual rationale was, but in the end, it was a surprise for me. I was not expecting it at all.
I think the takeaway here is that the way that they were analyzing the costs and benefits, or the risk reward of going to this hearing, for one reason or another, it shifted. So the benefit here, like you touched on, is that they're not pissing off arguably their best position player right now, which is fine. But that's a benefit that's always been there. It was a benefit that they could have pursued with Josh Hader, with Corbin Burns in these past cases, but they didn't. They did not think that that was a greater benefit, or that the pros of doing that outweighed the cons that would come financially, the cons with, setting new precedents in this system that favor not only these current players, but future players who may be coming through this Brewers system. They didn't do that here. So again, to review the numbers, Contreras filed at 6.5 mil for arbitration. The Brewers filed at 5.6, which exactly matched what Cal Raleigh had agreed to. In effect, setting a precedent for the first year arbitration eligible catcher, the only exception being Buster Posey, who, as we talked about, had like the best catching season of all time that year. So he doesn't really factor into this discussion at all. So the Brewers went above that now by agreeing to at least 6.1 million for William in 2025, which, good for him. I'm happy he got his money. I want to make that very clear. The stance that I think we both try to take on this is, if you want us to express a rooting interest, it is player gets money, because
Mm-hmm.
the people who own MLB teams and run MLB teams and MLB itself, they have more of the money that baseball generates than the players do. So I would always prefer that as much of that as possible gets deferred to the players or sent to the players, funneled to the players, whatever you want to say. But at the same time, we're going to go off of just kind of our common sense and the little bits and pieces we can pick up from how baseball finances seem to work to understand, okay, this is how things are. And the Brewers are going to play within the rules of how other teams do it as well. Every team is usually going to take advantage of any benefits or any systems that are in place that could benefit them. So that's the way that we've always tried to approach it. But this is the Brewers thinking of it in a different way for one reason or the other. I don't know exactly what it was. Maybe it was kind of this combination of, like you talked about, they actually didn't think they had a great chance of winning the ARB case. But they did give in to the point of now there is a new baseline that future catchers can look at, and it's that 6.1 million. As far as that club option goes, that's not getting picked up. We're going to do this entire cycle again next year, so people should be ready for that. To me, the only way that option gets picked up is if William basically does have like that Buster Posey caliber season, because then you're looking at it like, okay, now that 12 million is probably a steal for the Brewers instead of, vice versa. But otherwise, it would take a lot for Contreras to match that kind of money in an ARB settlement next year or in an ARB case. So that's almost certainly getting turned down. You can basically look at it as William Contreras is going to make 6.1 million, counting 2025, and then that $100,000 buyout on the option, which is a middle ground between where he and the Brewers filed, but it's a financial concession on the Brewers' part that we're not used to seeing. And it is a little surprising, but it is good news that these two are going to now maintain just a better relationship on that front. Nobody's complaining about this whatsoever. We're just pointing out that it is different. It's not something we expected, and that's why it's not something we expected. But let's not talk about baseball finances anymore, because we have actual real life tangible baseball discussion to talk about. Pitchers and catchers reporting to Phoenix, to the Brewers spring training facility. A lot of position players are there as well. This is kind of how it usually goes. Today is just the required date when pitchers and catchers need to show up, but usually guys show up early, some even before this date of February 12th. But we're going to run down really quickly a couple of bits of news that surfaced right away from Brewers camp. A lot of it really pitching centric. But the headline from today was Brandon Woodruff, who held court with the media in the clubhouse for a little bit. If you remember, probably I don't think it was 2 weeks ago yet, but like a week and a half ago, when that interview with Pat Murphy came out in the Journal Sentinel, in which he said that Brandon Woodruff was not likely going to be ready for opening day. Brandon Woodruff then commenting to the media today, saying that he felt a need to set the record straight because, in his words, he saw people characterizing this as meaning he had a setback. So basically what he told the media on day one of spring training is that he's a full participant in spring training. He is healthy, but it's going to still be, a longer ramp up process based on what he's coming back from. So he, couldn't commit to being ready for opening day. So this is kind of funny to me because really there's nothing he said here that contradicted anything that Pat Murphy said. And I'm also not entirely sure. Again, I hadn't looked super deeply into what everyone was saying about this. I don't think I ever saw anyone actually characterize it as a setback. So I'm a little bit curious where he's getting that from. Again, maybe there was something I missed. What I do know is, like, after this news came out, I could already see some of like the aggregators putting together the headlines of Pat Murphy shares discouraging update on Brewers ace Brandon Woodruff. And that was kind of why I wrote what I wrote in response to this news, which if you go back and read that story that I published a few days ago at Brewer Fanatic, my point was this is not a sign that he's behind schedule. What Murphy said doesn't mean he's behind schedule. It doesn't mean anything is wrong. It's just a reminder of, hey, he's coming back from a major shoulder surgery that always had a really unclear, muddied outlook and an uncertain prognosis for when he was going to be able to come back, what he was going to look like when he was going to be able to come back. And I also stress that like being fully healthy and being ready to pitch in games and then being able to pitch well in games, those are all going to be on different timelines. So he's healthy now. He told us he was healthy, and nobody said he wasn't healthy. But that doesn't necessarily mean he's going to be ready for opening day. It doesn't necessarily mean he's even going to look all that close to the same guy this year. He even said himself when he talked to Adam McCalvy a few weeks ago, he doesn't expect to have a full gauge on where his stuff is at until he gets to the second half this year, just because you need to understand what he's trying to work back from and what that process looks like. So what I'm guessing happened here is a lot of people, when they heard Pat Murphy's comments, right away their response was to assume that that meant something was wrong or that there had been a setback. So then you have people, at some other outlets or some other blogs or what have you, characterizing it that way. And even if they don't say setback, at least like framing it in headlines as discouraging update or things of that nature. I can understand how either Brandon Woodruff would see that or someone would mention it to him in passing, because these guys do read what's written about them. Different guys have different levels of like how much they seek it out, or some guys don't seek it out, but they have people bring it up to them anyway. But it's 2025. Information on the internet travels very quickly, and even if for someone who's not always clearly seeking it out, you're probably going to find out about it either way. So through one means or another, Brandon Woodruff probably heard, that characterization of it, and that's kind of how he took it then, as people assuming there was something wrong or that there had been a setback or that there was, that kind of misinformation being funneled throughout the internet. So I understand why he wanted to clarify things here, but this whole situation is just kind of funny to me because in my mind, all of this should have been pretty obvious, like given what he was coming back from, given what he said over the winter, what Pat Murphy just said, and then what he's saying now. Like it all tracks. Like it's all coming back to the same thing. He's coming back from a serious procedure, a serious injury. And even though he's fully healthy, it's still going to be a longer than normal timeline because they got to make sure that as he's facing live hitters for the first time in a year and a half, that was the other announcement that was a part of this as well. He said he's scheduled to face live hitters on Friday this week. So that is going to be a big milestone for him, the first time he'll get a chance to do that since the surgery. But it's a long recovery timeline. That's really just what we need to keep coming back to. It's a long recovery timeline. You need to understand what he's trying to come back from and just be realistic about how things are going to look over the next few months.
Yeah. This is like you. I hadn't really seen it being called a setback specifically. I did see when the Murph interview first came out, some people who were definitely disappointed, I think, with what he had said about Woody and kind of some of the things that I think the expectations, as much as we have on this podcast tried to, make sure we're trying to keep them in check a little bit for Woodruff, I still think the fan base as a whole, understandably, is excited about Woodruff coming back and have these, big dreams on what he's going to be able to do this year. And I'm not going to rule anything out for Brandon Woodruff this year. We've said that numerous times. There's still a possibility that he does come back and pitch really well. But I think the expectation or relying on that as fans is giving people different ideas with every update of what is reality. It's kind of straying from reality because we have these ideas in our head and how things are supposed to be going for Woodruff that haven't really ever been said or proclaimed by anybody. There's never been a timeline, like Jack said. We've never had one. And he was asked specifically today if there was a date in his head that he would get back on a major league mound in a game. And he right away said, nope, there isn't. Like it's just on his body and how it's reacting and how things are progressing and everything there. So this is part of the reason we've tried to keep expectations in check, just so that there isn't disappointment from either Woodruff's side, because he has to do a good job of keeping himself in check and not trying to push things and not trying to do things too quickly to get back, but also just for fans, because I think it's just going to lead to disappointment no matter what happens for Woodruff, even though he might perform well. He might do fine. He might not be great, but I think we just have to keep everything just in check a little bit. And I think that's what led to some of the, disappointment. Like I said, I'm sure some people categorized it, like you said, who just saw the interview, saw a couple quotes, the aggregators who love to get clicks on or likes or whatever they're trying to get engagement on social media. They'll take stuff out of context happily and use it as a means to get people to click on their stuff. But I think in the Brewer sphere, I think everybody who's reporting it was pretty honest and forthright about what Murph had said, and kind of just said this isn't really that unexpected. It's something that we had to know was a possibility. Best case scenario, obviously, would have been Woodruff coming into spring somehow feeling great and ready to go. And yeah, he's just going to get built up and he's starting on opening day. Like, that would obviously be best case scenario, but that was never realistic. So if that was what people were hoping for, I think they were probably just setting themselves up to be upset or disappointed with whatever news came out. I think he's on the timeline that most people would be expecting, and we're just going to have to see how he progresses in spring. And then I would guess most likely into the season before we actually end up seeing him, but we don't know. We really don't. So we just got to play it by ear, see how he feels. That's how Woodruff and the team are handling it too. They're all kind of going to have to go off of how he feels, what the doctors are seeing, what the trainers are seeing, and what Woodruff is feeling. And from there, that's what we'll find out, or that's where we will find out what we have in Brandon Woodruff this year.
I'm going to encourage people again as well. Just listen to the entirety of his comments from day one of spring training, because my guess is there's also probably going to be some people who latch on to just the headline grabbing part of his comments where he said, I'm a full participant in spring training, and people are going to run with that and now say, kind of swing to the other end of the spectrum and say, oh, see, he's 100%. He can probably be ready for opening day, this, that, and the other. No, he's a full participant for spring training. He's fully healthy, but nobody has committed to his availability for any point of the season, really. There's just been kind of this like rough understanding he will be ready to pitch for the Brewers at some point in 2025, but that's it. Nobody's committed to opening day. Nobody has really put a firm timeline on everything, and there's a reason for that. Like we've been talking about, this is a very tricky thing to come back from. And sometimes the progress isn't always linear either. So we kind of just have to play it by ear, see how things unfold. And I'm going to stick with what I think both of us have been saying pretty consistently for the past couple months now, at least over the offseason. Like if you get in 2025 roughly 100 innings from Brandon Woodruff and he's a capable back of the rotation starter, like let's say he's in like that 90 to 100 inning range and he's got an ERA in like the low fours or something, like I'm sure nobody would tell you that that's the ultimate goal of where he wants to end up when he's like, when all is said and done and the dust settles as he continues his career. But in terms of 2025 accomplishments, given what he's coming back from, that is a big accomplishment.
Mm-hmm.
And it should be seen as such. I'm afraid that there's going to be a lot of people who see that as a disappointment when in reality, that should be seen as a positive thing. I'm not saying he can't do more than that. I personally don't expect him to, given what he's trying to come back from. But if he is able to hit that point, like that is a big deal. And, the 100 innings mark too, I said this to you off the air earlier today. Like that's not a crazy low number either. It probably sounds like it to some people, but let's kind of walk back here and look at Brandon Woodruff's track record. For as good as he's been, and he has been one of the best starters in baseball, over the last probably 5 or 6 years or so when he's been healthy. But the one knock you can make against him is health. He's never exceeded more than 180 regular season innings, and he hit that in 2021. 2022, 153 innings. 2023, when he was dealing with these injuries in the first place, 67 innings. Now he hasn't pitched a full year. Like, I do think 100 is like a pretty good mix of, we have some faith that he's able to work back from this to get to this level, and it's also not like a crazy low expectation either. Like I think it's a good mix of you're not setting your sights too high to the point that you're chasing something unrealistic and you're setting yourself up for disappointment, but it's also not like a crazy low expectation either. So I'm going to be consistent still in kind of where I'm setting my personal expectations for him. I don't think there's anybody who covers the Brewers who's not pulling for Brandon Woodruff to have like the best possible comeback season. And everybody knows he's one of the most competitive guys in that clubhouse. But like, let's just be smart about how we're thinking about this, because the Brewers are going to have to be smart. Woodruff's going to have to be smart. And it sounds like from all accounts they are. So I think if there's anyone who's rooting for him along the way who's not in that clubhouse, you can set kind of whatever benchmark you want, but if you want our 2 cents on it, that's kind of where we're setting the bar. So
Yeah.
Moving on from that topic, unless you have any more to add,
No,
we have a couple
you
more
covered
things
it.
we can discuss from day one of camp, mainly injury updates. Some not so good news coming on the DL Hall front. Another guy who didn't pitch a whole lot in 2024, or at least nearly not as often as the Brewers were hoping, due to a couple of different injuries. He's already coming into spring training behind the 8 ball a little bit. He's got a lat injury that he's dealing with. Been shut down for at least a few weeks here, according to Pat Murphy, and then they'll reevaluate him. This isn't something that it sounds like is going to prevent him from making the team in some capacity, but I would be willing to guess at the very least he's not going to have time to stretch out.
Yep.
So this probably is something that takes him out of contention for a rotation spot. So that kind of leaves us in a different space now as far as how this rotation mix sets up, because if you're assuming Brandon Woodruff's not ready for opening day, you're assuming DL Hall is probably not going to be able to stretch out. Now guys like Aaron Ashby, Connor Thomas, and now one other candidate who we're going to talk about in a few minutes here. Those are probably your front runners now, or at least your main mix of guys who are competing for that fifth starter gig. But we'll find out a little bit more as camp gets underway here. For now, a couple of questions that we got pertaining to DL Hall. Logan asked us, did it ever come out if DL Hall had knee surgery? It never did officially. And I haven't heard if he did or not. The word always was, though, that it was recommended he have knee surgery after the season. Doctors told him he could pitch through it during 2024 and then try to get it cleaned up over the winter. It has never come out definitively, though, if he did or not. So we'll see if we get some word on that within the next few weeks. And then Mason asked, with Hall likely to be a bit behind everyone else due to his lat injury, what are your thoughts on Chad Patrick's chances to make the opening day rotation as a fifth or sixth starter? He's probably like in that next tier after the names that I just rattled off. Wouldn't you agree?
Yep, I would agree. I think Thomas is going to have a leg up on him because he has to be rostered if he's going to be kept in the organization. And then, like you said, there was a major league deal that we'll talk about in a little bit here that is obviously going to have a leg up on him because he's on a major league deal. And and Ashby, I'm still not sure I totally buy him being able to move back to the rotation, but he's going to have a leg up in that, at least to start spring training as well. So it also kind of seems like with how they've been operating, they want to have another lefty in the rotation. I don't know if that's a huge factor here, but we just listed 3 lefty options who are replacing a potential lefty option. And it kind of feels like they want 2 lefties and 3 righties or something, or that kind of mix to be available to them at least. So I'm not sure that's, again, the biggest reason here, but I wonder if it is kind of factoring in just they want to give teams different looks throughout a series. So yeah, I think you're right. He's kind of in that next tier of guys who would be considered if there's more injuries or if guys just aren't showing what we're expecting.
The fact that he's got options left kind of puts him just naturally lower on that totem pole, because he probably is going to be a guy who does a little bit of bouncing around throughout 2025. But yeah, there's already 2 guys in competition most likely for this spot who don't have options. Chances are the Brewers are going to try to roster both of those guys as well. So you're probably looking at one cracks the rotation, one ends up in the bullpen. If we're being honest, Ashby's probably third on that list potentially, because he can still be optioned to the minor leagues. So you're probably looking at him as third on that list, and then Patrick's kind of in that next tier. Some additional injury updates also emerging from Brewers camp. Jefferson Cairo, one of the Brewers' top prospects, catching prospect. He's expected to play in games at some point during spring training, reports Todd Rosiak of the Journal Sentinel. Cairo estimates that he's at about 75 to 80% physically at this moment, but he underwent shoulder surgery very early last year, got hurt, and I believe it was his first game in AAA
First
of
at
the
bat.
season.
Reached first and then got hurt, diving back into first base, I think, on the next pitch. So before the next pitch was thrown. So he saw about 4 pitches of AAA ball.
Good stuff.
Yeah.
Really tough day for Spencer as well as the prospect expert. But it had a little bit of a ripple effect just on how the Brewers were kind of able to approach their catching core that year, because he was one of the guys as well, Cairo, who effectively, I don't want to say wasted a 40-man spot because that makes it sound like it was his fault, but he was on the 40-man because the Brewers protected him from the Rule 5 draft, and they could have promoted him to the big leagues and put him on the big league IL, but then he starts picking up service time in a season when he hasn't played at all. So they ended up just keeping him in the minor leagues on the minor league IL. But that, along with Abner Uribe, who had kind of a similar thing happen, that ended up essentially putting the Brewers in a spot where they had to operate on a 38-man roster instead of a 40-man. But Cairo will be back in games at some point this year. I wouldn't be shocked if we see him in the big leagues too. Right now, you're looking at Eric Haas as the backup, and that's kind of a can of worms we can discuss a little bit later, because he's interesting, but I also don't think he's actually going to hit particularly well in the big leagues this year. But we'll end up seeing what happens with him. It's an interesting profile. Robert Gasser is still on track for a late August or early September return from Tommy John surgery. I believe he underwent the full procedure, if I'm getting that recall correct off the top of my head.
Yes.
Yeah, it was the full Tommy John. So he's looking at a little bit of the longer end of kind of that 12 to 14 month timeline. So as of now, still on track, but if we're being honest, probably a toss up whether he appears for the Brewers this year. There's going to have to be a lot of things that go right, especially if you're pushing into September already. Just kind of the right combination of needs, where he's at, how he looks in rehab, and no setbacks along the way, of course, which he hasn't had any so far, so that's good news. But we'll kind of see how that unfolds. Trevor McGill, in what is a very Pat Murphy description, has dealt with a couple little strange ones that have put him back a little bit. But he says he should be fine. So whatever that means. But possibly something to keep an eye on. We'll learn more in the coming days. Abner Uribe is also going to be another guy who's going to have a little bit of a slower buildup in camp because, like we mentioned a couple seconds ago, coming off that knee surgery as well. So another guy who I think is also going to be very interesting to watch in Brewers camp, because, he's always going to be someone who's cited as being in the mix for a high leverage role, especially now that Devin Williams is gone. But to me, there's still a lot of things that kind of need to come together. You already had control issues, the issues with properly channeling how competitive he is and how fiery he is on the mound. You have the suspension that's playing into the mix as well here. And then once you add the potential delay that could transpire from having to, ramp up a little bit more slowly from the knee injury here, it's kind of a pretty big storm that's brewing a little bit now in terms of his ability to really make an impact, especially early in the year. But we'll see what happens on that front. Final update from camp that's not related to the transaction we'll talk about. Freddie Peralta is going to start opening day. I don't think that's particularly surprising news to anybody, especially kind of given the status of the rest of the rotation right now, some of the things we just talked about. Freddie Peralta, once again, is going to start opening day for the Brewers, this time opening in the other New York Stadium, playing the Yankees this time around instead of the Mets and Queens. Now we can actually move on to this super mystical signing that we've been alluding to. The Brewers making their first MLB, like full MLB signing of the offseason on the first day of spring training. Left-handed swingman Tyler Alexander agreeing to a one-year contract. We don't know any of the terms yet, but my guess is it's not going to be anything crazy. This is a guy who was non-tendered by the Rays a few months ago. This is just very Brewersy. Like, this is the Brewersiest signing to ever Brewers. We'll pull up some graphics in a couple seconds here. If you're watching on video, we'll walk through it in detail if you're listening on audio only. But kind of a way to frame this, and it actually ties into the question we got about this. So Andrew asked us, is our new big free agent left-handed pitching signing going to be this year's Colin Ray, or is he going to be a forgettable arm we acquired? I mean, right now I would say probably very similar chances of both. I would probably lean toward the first one just because I think we all trust the Brewers' pitching development pretty wholeheartedly at this point, and we've seen them have success with these kinds of profiles countless times before. But yeah, he profiles as basically a lefty Colin Ray. So I'll pull up the graphic here really quick if you're watching on video. But this is a movement plot. Well, not just a movement plot. It's a movement plot, pitch mix, and arm angle for Colin Ray and Tyler Alexander. So if you're not watching on video, I'll walk through this graphic really quick. Basically, the arsenal is very, very similar already. So Colin Ray last year was in order of pitch usage: sinker, cutter, four-seam, sweeper, splitter, curve. Tyler Alexander last year was cutter, four-seam, sweeper, change, sinker. And if you kind of look at now the movement plot, yes, he's missing the curveball that Ray had, but Ray only threw that like 4% of the time last year. It wasn't really much a part of his plan of attack. So then when you throw that out of the mix, you're basically looking at a very, very similar arsenal. Really the only like difference here, if you want to be a little picky, is number one, Colin Ray throws a little harder. He averaged 92 with his fastballs last year. Tyler Alexander averaged just under 90 miles an hour with his four-seamer and sinker. And then the other difference is basically, like, if you think of Colin Ray's range of pitch movements that he has, just take that and stretch it out horizontally a few inches and you have Tyler Alexander. But otherwise, it's very, very similar all the way down to the arm angle. So Colin Ray, as a right-handed pitcher, had a 35-degree arm angle last year. And Ray's like 6'4", I think. Tyler Alexander has a 36-degree arm angle from the left side, and he's 6'2", I believe. So, like, you're getting very, very similar all the way down to, like, where they're releasing the ball. The only difference is you're basically, like, you're mirroring him across the rubber. You have a lefty instead of a righty. But so much stuff here lines up, like, all the way down to, like, it's going to be four-seam sinker cutter for the fastballs, sweeper for the breaking ball. Alexander's changeup appears to be a better pitch than Colin Ray's splitter was, although in terms of like vertical movement, they're actually very, very close as well. So, yeah, I mean, basically you're looking at left-handed Colin Ray here.
Yeah, I mean, I saw the news right before I left work today, and I kind of just took a little peek at Alexander, and my first thought is like, oh, this looks like Colin Ray from the left side. And then you had texted me while I was driving back, and I saw it when I got back, and I was like, yep, you had the exact same thought as me when I first looked at him. And then yeah, when you brought the comparison up, I mean, it's uncanny. It is pretty much like you said. It's a little more stretched out. Alexander just gets a little bit more horizontal movement on most of the stuff. Even I guess vertical movement on the fastball a little bit more as well, but in general, it is a very, very similar profile, and I would imagine they're going to attempt to use him very similarly to Ray. Now, it looks like the Rays went heavier on the cutter versus, it was more sinker for Ray as his primary fastball. I wonder if the Brewers will go the opposite way, if they'll go more towards what Ray did. I don't know. It'll be interesting, but either way, it definitely seems like they're kind of trying to emulate that. We've talked about how like Grant Anderson was a bit of a mirror of Hobie in some ways. it kind of feels like they're trying to do that with Ray from the left side now. And yeah, it's interesting. It's somebody who, this is the type of profile the Brewers have kind of been able to maximize. We've talked about it. We talked about it last episode a lot with the deception. I imagine this is somebody that they like for that reason, somebody that they think they can mix the shapes together and make it tough on hitters to make decisions. He's not going to blow you away. Like we said, he throws a couple miles per hour softer than Ray, who is nowhere near a flamethrower. But he has all these different shapes. He has all these different things. He can kind of move the ball around. He can throw them out of the same tunnels. And yeah, it'll be interesting. I think he's, as we mentioned earlier, he'll probably now have a shot at that fifth spot in the rotation. If not, he can be one of those guys who ends up in that Bryce Wilson type role, like we've talked about with a number of guys. Connor Thomas and him, I would imagine right now are going to be fighting for which, barring them, one of them performing really poorly or just not showing anything that the Brewers like moving forward, I would imagine they're kind of fighting for that fifth spot or that Bryce Wilson type role. And there's a pretty good chance we see those two in those roles. It's just a matter of which one ends up in which, unless DL Hall makes a, faster recovery than we're expecting or whatever, but given what we know right now, I think that's kind of the position battle, if you will, for those two. So it'll be interesting to watch. I think that's now almost a nice little storyline for spring training for us to be able to watch. And I think that's always something fans are looking for, is something to really latch onto and pay attention to in spring. And I kind of think Alexander gave us one now, because I do think him and Thomas are either going to be fighting for a roster spot or kind of battling for a certain position or role within the roster. So yeah, it's numbers wise, there's really nothing that would be very exciting for this one. It's not something that you look at the ERA, the FIP is not good either. It's pretty much the same as the ERA. Walks are pretty much the one thing. He's in the zone consistently, does not walk many. And I think the Brewers probably feel like that even maybe gives them a leg up in what they like to do, because now a guy can command the pitches. If you can give him a good plan with those pitches and kind of work them off each other, and he's able to command each of them, that might make it even a little bit easier to create that deception that they're looking for. So that'll be something interesting to watch. But yeah, I guess we can also say we officially have a full MLB signing for the Brewers. Everybody can take them off their list now. Now the Cardinals are the only team, because the Marlins signed Cal Quantrill today. Don't know why I can't say Quantrill. But the Brewers and Marlins are now off the list. The Cardinals are the only team who have not made a major league signing this offseason. So I didn't care about that at all, but some people seem to care about it deeply. So the Brewers are off the list, and we can stop talking about that now.
Have you seen that, like, the Cardinals head of baseball operations is out here, like, publicly commenting on how he wants to try to trade Arenado to one of these 5 teams that he can approve a trade to? I saw that. I was like, why is he? It was like stunning to see him being that open about that. I mean, I guess you don't have a whole lot of leverage anyway, because Arenado's the one who's going to have to pull that switch.
Yeah.
But at the same time, like, part of the reason why the Brewers, I assume, are always so quiet about this stuff is because, like, if you're Matt Arnold, what's the benefit of him telling, us in the media this stuff? Like, I understand why he does the whole nothing speak routine all the time. It makes sense. So, like, then to see, St. Louis, to see their executives, like, being so revealing or just willing to pull the screen back on that, it just kind of blew my mind a little bit.
I don't see any benefit of that. I didn't even see, well, I kind of heard about it, but I didn't see the exact comments. But I don't know what you're gaining from that at all.
Right. But to get back to Tyler Alexander here, the last thing I just want to touch on with him is, well, first of all, this is absolutely going to be a guy I'm going to try to talk to in spring training when I'm down there on the back end next month. But one of the things that I would like to get a little more info on is the changes he made to the pitch mix when he went from the Tigers to the Rays last year. So it feels like it's a given. If you go to the Rays, they're going to try to change something with your shapes. We saw them do it with Aaron Savali last year, who the Brewers brought in.
Mm-hmm.
And it was the same adjustment. They went to a big sweeping slider instead of like the normal kind of like basically gyro pitch that he was throwing the year before or years prior in Detroit. So that was one of the adjustments he made. If you're looking at the graph I have up on the screen right now, he also tweaked the cutter a little bit. So I was looking through this. He's actually an interesting guy because I didn't quite go into this much detail in like the introductory piece I wrote on him when the news broke. This is a guy who has been trying for years to kind of feel things out, I think, and get to the best version of himself. The pitch mix has changed a little bit from year to year in terms of like usage, where he's locating. Like at the start of his career, it was a lot of cutters and four seamers, like everything at the bottom. Then starting in, I want to say like 2022, it was he started going like high cutters and high four seamers, and then everything else down. And that continued with the Rays this year. But in 2023, his last year with the Tigers, he kind of reshaped that cutter a little bit. He went from being where he's usually been, which is more of like a slidery type cutter, to kind of nudging it a little bit more towards like fastball cutter territory. So in 2023, he added like a mile and a half of velo to it. He added like 2.5 inches, I think, of vert to it, so a little more carry. He shaved a couple inches of glove side movement off of it. He was backspinning it a little bit more, not like, serious backspin, but like trending a little closer to backspin than where he was before. So it looked like he was trying to make this into more of like a cut fastball, or at least closer to a cut fastball than what he was throwing before. But then when he went to Tampa Bay, he went back to where he was before. So he made that cutter a little more slider like again. But then because he replaced the slider with this big sweeper now, basically the way I described it in the introductory story I wrote, and what I'm going to say again here as we're looking at these graphs is, if you're like looking at his pitch movement graph, his induced movement graph, you can draw a much cleaner diagonal line through his 2024 shapes than you can through his 2023 shapes. So basically he's got an arsenal now that's just way cleaner for working a lot of in and out, east west. And that's what I'm really curious to see here. Like, how are the Brewers going to work with that? Because you could look at what he's going with and say, maybe we shouldn't be doing this high cutter thing nearly as much, and maybe we should bring that pitch down a little more and just focus more on, let's just kind of make the middle of the plate our target and let everything tunnel off of that. So the cutter is going to go glove side off the middle, sinker is going to go arm side off the middle, four seamer is going to have a little bit of carry off the middle. And then, if we need to go longer than the cutter, that's when we throw the sweeper in, things like that. Change up as well. He does use his changeup a lot more than Ray used his splitters, so that's kind of something to note here as well. But it is 5 distinct shapes now. He seems to be in a better spot than he was before, which is why it was a little surprising to see the results get so much worse for him. Home runs are always going to be a big part of this too. He struggled with the long ball even more than he normally does last year, which is going to be something to monitor as he comes to Milwaukee. But I'm just curious to kind of see what the Brewers do, like with this cutter slider thing, and then how much do they use, or cutter sweeper thing, and then how much do they use the sinker?
Yeah.
He's a guy who, like, he's not, I don't think they're going to try to add another pitch here or bring back the slider like they did with Savali, because Savali's thing was, if you're looking at this movement plot, like the separation between his pitches was kind of dramatic, like movement wise, because he was throwing so many big movement pitches. And that's why they brought the slider back, because they wanted to kind of fill that gap between like the cutter and the sweeper. Alexander doesn't have that here because he's a little more slider like with his cutter. Like the sweeper just is basically like an extension of the cutter movement wise. And it kind of, that progression just works really nicely. There's no room to add anything. But I do wonder, like, is there a possibility they go back to more of the fastball kind of version of the cutter, and then do they try to plug like a gyro in between? Because if there is anything resembling a gap here, I don't think it's really a big deal. But if you want to really be nitpicky, it's between that four seamer and the cutter. If you're looking at this chart, like that gap is a little bigger now because he went from the back spinner to more of the slidery type version of it. So do they want to shift that cutter back a little bit to where it was a year ago, a year before, And then do they try to add something in the middle there? I'm not sure. There's a couple different directions they can go with this. My guess is we're going to see more sinkers no matter what, because that's just kind of a rule when you come to the Brewers at this point. If you throw a decent sinker or two-seamer, they're going to have you use it quite a bit. But just kind of a continuation of what we've seen. This is a very well-rounded arsenal. I think this is a guy who's still trying to figure out the best way to use it. There's a lot here for the Brewers to mold according to the way they like it. This is going to be a profile Chris Hook loves to work with. And my guess is we're going to see them pull out a very familiar set of tricks here. I mean, at this point, you kind of are you're running out of new things you can do with these guys because you've brought in so many of them. So we're probably going to see, some version of what we've seen them do before with these kind of guys.
Yeah. I've got nothing to add. I already got my 2 cents in on them.
All right. Well, then we can move on to some listener questions for the week. Some relating to pitchers and catchers reporting, some not, because you could still make the case that there is off-season business for the Brewers to wrap up here. But we'll talk about that as we dive into these a little bit more. First question comes from Steve, who asks, I'm sure this question is born of little brother paranoia, but do you foresee any adjustment period to losing Quentin Berry and Walker McKinven to the two Chicago teams? I know the players play, but Berry felt instrumental in the run game and outfield defense. How does it compare to losing Derek Johnson to the Reds a few years ago? I think we talked about this at the time when these guys went to their new positions. So we'll keep this brief. But to me, I think you're going to feel the loss of Walker McKinven a little more than Quentin Berry. I don't think either one is going to sink the Brewers in either field that those guys specialized in. But when you look at what each of these two guys are responsible for, Quentin Berry was both the base running guru and the positioning and outfield coach guru. Those are things that, to me, they're the things that he instilled in these players. It's stuff it's more straightforward to retain that and to continue accessing that moving forward. Like if Q Berry's giving these guys pointers on like cues to look for, things to look for with the pitcher to try to time your leads and time your jumps, that's stuff that I think they're going to be able to remember. So I don't think that's knowledge that's exclusive to Quentin Berry. I think they're going to be in a pretty good spot there. In fact, I wouldn't be shocked if you really don't have any impact there at all. And I think it makes sense for him too that now he's going to a job with the Cubs as the third base coach where he has a chance to kind of start fresh, and he now gets a chance to reinstill that stuff in a new group of players. I'm not sure how much more there was left for him to do here. Not that, anyone would have complained if he had stuck around, but I think the opportunity he's got in Chicago now does make more sense for him. Walker McKinven was responsible for a lot of game planning and pitch calling stuff, and just generally being the go-between guy between the front office and the players. He was essentially like a front office guy in the dugout in some respects. He was kind of the bridge. And to me, that's so much more, all of those things, they're all so much more case by case. There's just a broader spectrum of constantly having to apply things that there's got to be some feel there for how you do it. To me, that's harder to replicate. It's harder to find a guy who's good at that. And when Walker leaves, yes, you do still have Chris Hook, you still have Jim Henderson. Jim Henderson, by the way, is basically, it sounds like sliding into the Walker role, or at least taking on a lot of his responsibilities. But not everyone's going to want to call pitches the same way. It's not nearly as straightforward as okay, here are some things to keep in mind, like principles of base running, or shouting at an outfielder hey, this is where the spray charts say you need to be positioned. I think it's a lot less straightforward, and it's so much more a case by case application. I think that's when you have the potential to feel a lot more, because you're not going to have the same guy who has necessarily that same feel or that same way of doing it when it comes to deciding, okay, how do we want to call a game here? Which pitches should we be throwing in this situation? What kind of mix should we use for this guy? Or how do I best communicate to this player what the front office told me? I think that's just it's more of a unique skill, I think, in this game still. And that doesn't mean Jim Henderson's not going to be very good at it. My guess is he will be. But I don't think he's going to quite be Walker McKinven. So if
Yeah.
there is one that you have the potential to maybe notice a little bit, not saying we necessarily will all that often, but I do think that's the one where I'd lean like, yeah, maybe you could feel this one a little bit, but I don't think either way it's going to be a huge deal for the Brewers. But I do think McKinven was probably one of the more important personnel that they could lose this year.
Yeah, I agree. I think when we talked about it as it happened, I had mentioned it always felt like he was kind of the best managerial candidate on the staff for kind of the reasons you laid out. He's got the connection between the front office and the players, and that's kind of one of those things you have to be able to do as a manager. I think with Barry, and I don't think we ever talked about it, but they hired Julio Bourbon as the new first base coach. And it's a very similar background to that of Quentin Barry. It's a guy who was a fast base stealer in his career. Bourbon was a really big prospect when he was drafted. But it's an outfielder who is fast. He's a good base runner. It almost feels like there's going to be kind of an easy little transition. Like you said, I don't think Quentin Barry wasn't teaching things that were, world breaking. Nobody had thought of these things. Like it's pretty hard to do that as a base running coach. You're mostly just little tips and tricks. And like we had said at the time, I think maybe at that time, my only real concern, or if you want to call it a concern, was like the potential to lose his ability to recognize stuff in games as somebody who stole bases himself, did these things as a player. But I think with Bourbon, they kind of replace somebody. They have somebody who was a similar type of player and can probably do these things, at least to some degree, similarly to Barry. So I'm not worried about that one much. I do think, yeah, McKinven was a big loss. And I think that was, we talked about it at the time. It's a bigger loss than pretty much any other non-manager could have been, I think, from the pitching staff or from the coaching staff, short of Chris Hook. I think obviously pitching coach, they replaced most of the hitting coach staff anyway. So I can't really use that one as an example of anything either. But the biggest one that wasn't, one of the main three that everyone talk about, which is hitting coach, pitching coach, manager, because of what he did with the game planning, with the pitch calling, working with catchers. He was always kind of one of the main. Charlie Green seemed to get, I think, the most talk about receiving and catchers working with them in spring training and everything. But until this last year, Charlie Green was in the minors during the season. McKinven was the one working with them day to day in the majors. So he had a lot of responsibility. He did a lot of things that were very helpful to the team. And so I think that's the one you miss. And just to compare quickly to the Derek Johnson situation, we talked about this when there were thoughts of Hook potentially leaving. A guy like Johnson, we saw it when he left. Like there was an adjustment period for Chris Hook, who ended up being fantastic. But 2019, there were a lot of fans, and just from the outside, it didn't look great. It was his first year. The pitching staff took a step back. We had the Corbin Burns 2019 that everyone remembers, and a lot of people thought Chris Hook was not the answer. And in reality, it was more of an adjustment period. And obviously, Chris Hook ended up being a great answer. He's been fantastic in his role. I think of all of the, again, non-hitting or pitching or manager spots, this is the one that could have the biggest adjustment period of any other coaching position on the staff. I think it's one of those ones where there could be a bit of an adjustment period. It won't be as visible, I think, as a pitching coach would be, but I think it might show up more in, the pitch calling stuff. Maybe there's a little bit more where it's like, just, I don't think it's going to be a big issue, but I could just see, I guess, a little bit more of an adjustment period for that, kind of along the lines of like what we saw with Derek Johnson, just not to the same degree. So yeah, it's not something I'm super concerned about, but I do think of the two, McKinven has a better chance of showing an impact where fans might actually notice it.
Mason asked us, what is a 75th percentile outcome for Oliver Dunn? Is it a low 200s average with a good OBP and a decent slug? 15 home runs over 500 plate appearances. Spencer, do you want to start with this one?
Yeah, I
I have
can.
thoughts too, but
Yeah, I don't think that your example there is super far off. I think he has the capability to hit for a little bit more than like a low 200. I don't know what we're considering low 200s average, but I think he's one of those guys who could be in like that in a 75th percentile outcome, be in like that 240, 250 range, and it wouldn't completely shock me. But I think, yeah, it's a good OBP is what you're getting and a good outcome for Dunn. And then 15 homers over 500 plate appearances in a 75th percentile sounds about right. I think there are outcomes where he hits more homers. He hits the ball hard enough to hit more home runs than that over 500 plate appearances. But I'm always bad at estimating percentile outcomes for some of these things. But to me, that does sound pretty accurate. I think the only adjustment for me would maybe be a little bit higher average overall, partially because he's got the speed to get infield hits. Guys who are that fast don't usually hit for super low average while also having the other stuff going on, because they might get some infield hits. They might have some well, I guess that wouldn't really affect average, but they turn singles into doubles. They do things like that. So I think that's about right. I guess I would look at it as overall like an OPS for a 75th percentile for him is in that like 750 range to me. That feels about right. Like as a maybe even a little bit lower than that, but like a league average hitter is kind of what I would view as like a 75th percentile. And then you get good defense at third, most likely, and speed, and that can turn into a pretty good player pretty quickly. So, yeah, I guess just overall, I look at it as 75th percentile, probably being pretty close to slightly above league average as a hitter, 105 WRC plus, something along those lines. But like I said, I am not great at this because 50th percentile, I probably would have come up with similar answers if you didn't give me the 75th percentile one. So this is not one of my stronger suits, I would say. But I guess in my head, that's kind of what I'm thinking.
yeah, I'm going to shoot a little bit higher than you if we're for 75th. Probably say, I don't know, like 250 with probably an OBP that's not at 400, but I think he'd be pushing it because this is a guy who he does not chase like at all.
No.
So really what it's about for him is just he's just got to hit pitches in the strike zone well enough for opponents to honor that. That was what the problem was. He had an elite chase rate. It was only like 21%, I think, but he only had like a 5% walk rate because guys knew they could just pitch him in the strike zone. So laying off pitches outside the strike zone doesn't do anything for you if you're only seeing pitches in the strike zone. He had, I don't have the numbers up in front of me, but it was at the time he got hurt for players who had like played a decent amount in the big leagues so far that year. It was, if it wasn't the highest in zone rate, it was really, really close. I think he had a zone rate of like he was pushing 60%, which is like, that's absurd to see that many pitches in the strike zone, but that's a product of, not being able to make contact with those pitches. But if we're talking 75th percentile, that means he's done a pretty decent job of figuring that part of it out, which means I think the walks are going to come back pretty heavily. So yeah, like 250s, an OBP that's probably over 100 points higher than that. And I'm going to say over 20 home runs just because of the raw power. Then if we're talking like 100th percentile, that's where we get to the area in which I think I made some waves on Twitter a week ago when I said Ollie Dunn has a 5-win ceiling. That's like 100th percentile now we're talking about, where I think you're looking at a guy who's probably hitting like 270 with an OBP over 400, and he's hitting like 35 home runs and playing great defense at third base. Yeah, that's a 5-win player, like possibly even more.
I was gonna say that sounds like an 8-win player.
Well, okay, it depends on the defense, really, because it's looked good so far. And do we like? Is it good or is it great?
Right. True.
That's probably where the difference comes in there. But from what we've seen so far, we know it's good, and he's fast too. So if he's getting on base a lot, he's probably going to steal quite a few bases. But yeah, you're almost kind of pushing like a Jose Ramirez type player then at that point. Which actually, like if we're talking ceiling, it's probably not an insane comp.
No.
I'm not going to say it's a great one, but it's not an insane comp in terms of what you could get out of him. Problem is, as I'm always going to say, the floor is very low.
Yes.
Like this is kind of a similar to how we've approached Garrett Mitchell, just with like there's some major weaknesses here that are tapping or preventing him from tapping into what he can do. I think the reason I felt slightly better about Dunn at times is because he actually did elevate the ball in the minor leagues and would hit for power in the minors, which Mitchell never did. But yeah, you got to do something about the massive whiff rates that he had in the big leagues so far. If those don't improve, he's not getting anywhere close to any of these numbers, and he probably shouldn't be playing in the big leagues. I think he's a guy who does need more AAA time still, but there's a reason why the Brewers picked this guy up.
Yeah.
Because the ceiling legitimately is really high. When you look at the raw skill set, I know he's a small guy, so it might be easy to kind of not assume that he has all of these abilities. Like there aren't a lot of small guys who do all of these things, but he hits the ball really hard. He does not chase, like elite awareness of the strike zone, which is probably only going to continue to help him more if we get to a point where robot umps reach the big leagues or the challenge system reaches the big leagues. But really fast, a lot of raw power, really good eye, seems to be able to play capable defense. Like if the contact comes along, you're getting pretty close to a complete player.
Mm-hmm.
He's always going to strike out a lot. He's never going to get to a point where he's a contact hitter. It's really just can he get the Ks down enough to the point where he can let these other skills shine. But this is a high ceiling player, low floor player, but a high ceiling player. And, that's why the Brewers have him around. And it's part of the reason why I do think, for as much as I would like them to bring in someone who has a history of competency at third base, I think they should do that. They'd be better served doing that. My guess is between, the low floor, really high ceiling guy in Ollie Dunn, and then the high floor, low ceiling guy in Caleb Durbin. I would not be surprised if the Brewers' internal models actually feel okay about third base. And I guess that does kind of lead us into the final question we'll take, which comes from Mitchell. A lot of these guys are infielders that he's talking about. He asks us to rank the following players by your expected WAR by the end of the year. So wins above replacement. Sal Frelick, Garrett Mitchell, Bryce Terang, Joey Ortiz, Oliver Dunn, and Caleb Durbin. So we had a little discussion before we wanted to go over this one on camera about what version of WAR are we kind of adapting ourselves to, because you have Baseball Reference WAR, you've got Fangraphs WAR, you have Baseball Prospectus WAR. The Baseball Cube has their own version of WAR as well, I think, but that one is the one that you never really see cited. We decided we're going to go closer to the Baseball Reference version of WAR. That's the one that I tend to look at a lot for position players, unless you're a catcher. And a lot of it really, if you're wondering what the differences are, especially for position players in the different versions of WAR, it's really just defense more than anything. So like Bryce Terang's a good example. Bryce Terang, according to the Fangraphs version of WAR, was only at like 2.5 wins above replacement in 2024. According to the Baseball Reference version, he was worth almost 5 wins above replacement in 2024, and it's all defense. So Fangraphs is going off of ultimate zone rating to weigh defense. We were talking about this too. I don't know for sure. I think just in general, the weight of defense might be different between those two versions of WAR.
Yeah.
But Baseball Reference, for sure, the difference we know is they're going off of defensive runs saved. Personal opinion, I just think that's the best one, especially if we're evaluating infielders. Like none of them are perfect, but I think that's the one that's probably the closest in terms of, in my opinion, getting at defensive value. Defensive runs saved loves Bryce Terang. I think he finished the year at 22 in 2024, 22 defensive runs saved. So that's a big reason why he was so valuable. So with that, I can get into my list. If Terang stays at second base, I'm probably putting him first again on this list because the defense is going to continue to really prop him up in that version of WAR. If he moves to shortstop, it gets a little hairier because he's going to get a greater positional boost, like a base boost to his value, because WAR looks at shortstop and says, hey, that's a harder position to play than second base, so let's give him more credit for anything he does at shortstop. But the defensive performance, like just overall, he's a better second baseman than he will be as a shortstop. So you're kind of looking at that, those two factors countering each other, and it's kind of hairy where that mix ends up getting you to. So if he stays at second base, I'm putting him first. Ooh, it gets tricky after that. Should I take the optimistic route and put Mitchell second?
You can.
I think if the driveline stuff takes, he's second, I think. Because if he gets, even close to what he's done in the big league so far, for as much as we've talked about not really being believers in the profile, like there are a lot of things in that profile where if it does click a little more, he's going to be a WAR friendly player because he's playing in center field where you get like the most positional boost. And if you're playing good defense out there, hitting for even a little bit of power, giving some speed, getting on base, I'll put him second. I'm going to say Terang, Mitchell, Ortiz, Frelick, Durbin, Dunn.
Okay.
Again, for as much as I like Dunn's ceiling, I think that he's just so far away right now from reaching it.
Yeah.
That's the only reason I'm putting him at the bottom. So like let's say Bryce is like a 4-win player from defense again at second base. If Mitchell gets to like 3, Ortiz is an interesting one too, because in theory he should get a boost from playing short. It just, a lot of it comes down to what's the bat going to do in year 2. Mm-hmm. So he could be anywhere from 2 to, honestly, in a really good year, probably pushing 5.
Yeah.
But I'll put him behind Mitchell for now.
Yeah.
Frelick and Durbin, I think, are going to be, again, just kind of in that 2 area. I don't think they're going to hit much, but they're going to provide value with the speed and the defense. But the problem is they're not playing positions that are seen as premium defensive positions.
Right.
Like Sal's at right and Durbin's at either second or third, especially if Durbin's at third. And then again, Dunn, I think, is just not. I think it can happen at some point. I just don't know if it's going to happen early enough in 2025 that he's going to rack up that kind of value this season. Mm-hmm. I could see like a second half surge or something, and then that carries him into 26 a little bit. But that's where I kind of put that together in real time a little bit. I guess you could still say toss up maybe between Ortiz and Mitchell for second, but
yeah.
Otherwise, that's the order I'm going in. I don't know what you have in
Yep.
mind.
Yeah, it's those 3 at the beginning for me. It's Mitchell, Terang, and Ortiz. They're the top 3 for me. I am going to switch Ortiz and Mitchell only because I just don't trust that Mitchell will play enough and be able to stay healthy for a full season. But he's one of those guys who does rack up WAR quickly, it seems like. So he is somebody who, even if he only plays, 100, 110 games, which would be a career high for him, he would probably pass Ortiz. It wouldn't surprise me if he did, especially like you said, if the drive line stuff he's been working on and everything else just with the high fastballs does take at least decently. But he could easily finish first. I don't think that would surprise me at all. If he's healthy and that stuff takes, we've talked about it before, but the ceiling is pretty ridiculous for him. Like and like you said, it would be in a premium position where it gets even more heavily favored in a WAR type of statistic. So I'm going to go Terang, Mitchell, Ortiz, or Terang, Ortiz, Mitchell. But if Mitchell's healthy, I think he finishes second for sure, and maybe even first. It wouldn't surprise me. I will go Frelick next. I agree with that. I think I'd have to go Durbin over Dunn for the same reason you're talking about. I'm hoping Dunn starts the year in Nashville. I don't have a ton of faith he's going to, but I would like for him to get like 100 at-bats down there, at least, because he really hasn't touched AAA. He went down there for a couple of weeks last year and then had to come back, and then he had his injury when he was supposed to go back down and finally get the chance to develop down there. I would like to see at least like a month or two of at-bats in AAA, get used to a higher level in a less, strict environment where you need to perform immediately and everybody's relying on you and there's more pressure and all these things. Like, get used to seeing better pitching, get used to seeing all of these types of things in a not stress-free, but a less stressful environment. So I'm hoping that's the case. And then, like you said, I wouldn't be surprised if by the end of the season, Dunn is the guy who ends up, playing more than Durbin at third base or something because he's figured things out in AAA. But just with the amount of time that I kind of expect him to play there, I would put Durbin over Dunn as well. So only change for me is really flipping Mitchell and Ortiz.
Thank you all for your questions this week. It's now time for Spencer's Minor League Sandbox, and I see there's a Jesus Maude update listed on the first bullet point here, so I'm sure you're very excited to get into that.
Of course.
I'll let you take it away here.
All right. Yes, we have to talk a little Jesus Maude because there was an article that came out today on Baseball America, and it was showing, really, it was comparing him to every DSL player who has really just performed the last few years and guys who are now either top 100 prospects or right on the edge of it for Baseball America. So the biggest one, and the names that are probably most familiar to most fans, they put this in a graphic, so I'm comfortable sharing it because they put it on their socials. I wasn't going to share like the whole breakdown they did because that's behind a paywall, and I would like for them to be compensated for people being able to say that. But this they put on their Instagram, so I'm posting it here for those watching on video. You can see it. It's just how Jesus Maude compares to other DSL stars, and the two names they chose are Jackson Chourio and Junior Caminero. So everyone knows Chourio. I would imagine most people know Caminero, but he is a top 5 prospect. He debuted for the Rays last year. Third baseman, huge power. Actually formerly traded to the Rays in exchange for Tobias Myers. The Guardians, they don't love that trade looking back on it. And now they probably hate it even more because Tobias Myers is a quality starting pitcher for the Brewers and not even for them. So just comparing these guys, really on statistically, they all performed well. Maude did have the best raw numbers of the three, but there's always, a little bit of DSL defense, everything else that factors in here. So they looked at it more to a StatCast, raw ability type of what you did in terms of in-zone whiff, chase rate, and then max exit velo. That's all that's on the graph. They also had 90th percentile exit velocity on there. And for Maude, the big thing here is that there was a list of, I think it was 16, 17 players total. Nobody matched him in every category. Like, he is the only player who was borderline elite for his level in every category. So in terms of in-zone whiff rate, meaning pitches in the zone, how often were you whiffing? He only whiffed at a 10% rate. I believe there was only one player of the 17 who was better than that. I don't have it up right now. I'm trying to pull it up, but only one or two players were better than that. His chase rate was 15%, which was the best out of the entire grouping. And then his max exit velocity was 108.9, and the 90th percentile was 104.2, which I know that one was third out of all of the players on the list. So he combined hitting the ball extremely hard, not chasing. He made great swing decisions. And then when the pitch was in the zone, it wasn't an Oliver Dunn situation. He did not whiff on pitches in the zone. And comparatively, just easy one for everyone, Brewer fans. Chourio at that same age, at the same level. Actually, Maude is 2 months younger than Chourio was at this time in his career. Chourio whiffed on in-zone pitches at an 11% rate. So very similar to Maude, very, very good. It was a sign that he had very good bat-to-ball skills, but at the same time, he did chase at a 27% rate, which wasn't bad by any means, but it was quite a bit higher than the 15% that Maude just posted this last season. And then his max exit velocity was 106.8 compared to the 108.9 that Mate posted. And Churio's 90th percentile was 100.4 compared to the 104.2 that Mate posted. So we've all seen how quickly Churio's risen through the organization, what he's been able to do. And he was not at the same level that Mate is currently at. Now, I will give the reminder I will always give. Putting Jackson Chourio types of expectations on anybody is completely unfair. What he has done is borderline unprecedented. It's unprecedented for the Brewers, but it's very, very rare all around the league. Like what he has done in his rise through the system is crazy. But at the same time, this is ridiculous what Jesus Mate just did this last season. This is, by all accounts, Baseball America put out these numbers for a reason. They were making the case that Mate had pretty much the best profile coming out of the DSL that they have seen since post-COVID, basically. These are when the numbers started being pretty consistently tracked in the DSL, or very consistently tracked. They're tracked at every field now. In the past, they weren't, so it wasn't easy to get these types of numbers. But since COVID, and there's been plenty of good players to come through in that time, he's had by far the best profile, and that's why they felt so comfortable ranking him as highly as they did. They put him number 17 in their top 100 as a guy who hasn't even touched stateside games yet. And we're going to see him at Carolina most likely to start this next season. It would be a major upset if he's not, but it's just another example of how excited we can get about Mate. We don't want to go to a point where, again, we're putting unfair expectations on currently a 17-year-old. He won't turn 18 until May. He will most likely play in low A as a 17-year-old. But everything that we have seen so far points to a guy who has a legitimate shot at superstardom in terms of prospect potential. Everybody who has seen him play expects him to stay on the infield. Doesn't necessarily mean it'll be at shortstop, but there's a chance he sticks there. He has a cannon of an arm. They think there's a pretty good chance third base would just end up being where he moves if he needs to. And if infield happened to not work out, he has plus speed and he could play center field, and they don't think it would be an issue for him either. So in terms of as high a floor as a 17-year-old can have, he's kind of giving you all of the things that you would want to look for in somebody who has a pretty nice floor to work with for his age. Good defense, or at least a very high likelihood of sticking on the infield. He has the speed to make up for any shortcomings, offensively that might pop up. And then he also has the offense and all of these data points that just point to somebody who is doing things nobody's seen. So Mate, it's pretty hard to stop the hype train. Normally I'm trying to on DSL guys. I can't stop it myself right now. It's pretty hard to not be excited about it. And I can't wait to watch him in Carolina this year. As soon as that first game, unless, I'm at my own game coaching or something, I will definitely be tuning in and watching as much as I can, because I just need to see him play with my own eyes and just kind of see what it looks like. But he's very, very exciting. Moving on, I've been, kind of skimping on the minor league sandboxes lately. So I'm going to try and, while we go through spring training, I am going to attempt to at least one or two under the radar guys I want to touch on, and maybe guys to watch going into this next minor league season. So I'm going to go two right-handed pitchers today. First one being Dikembe Sanchez. This is a 19-year-old right-handed pitcher who is already sitting in the 92 to 95 range with a cutter. It's a really good looking pitch. He moved from the ACL. He made it all the way up to high A last year. He was pitching out of the pen, but he did pitch multiple innings a lot of times. He throws a cutter. He throws a slider. I think he was mixing a curveball at times. We didn't always have velocity readings, but it looked like a bigger shape with more downward movement than his slider. So I think he's throwing both breaking balls, and then he does throw a changeup. It doesn't kill a ton of velo right now, but it seems to have decent depth on it. So I think he's a 4-pitch guy with a cutter that plays. I'm really hoping they stretch him out. I think it's one of my most random hot takes or things I'm really hoping they do this year, but I would like to see Dikembe Sanchez stretched out and try and make him a starter because I think he has the stuff to do it. And yeah, he's just one of my favorite under the radar guys that nobody's really talking about, partially because he's been in a relief role, but really young dude already throwing 4 pitches. I would say 2 of them I would classify as above average or better, and the other 2 are playable more than you would expect from a guy who's throwing out of the pen. So seems like a starter candidate to me. And then the other one is Brian Rivera. I tweeted about him a couple days ago. I watched one of his starts in Carolina. This is a guy who also 19, seen him up to 96. He sits kind of in that 92 to 94 range. I believe he's throwing a 4-seam and a 2-seam, or he's just getting some run on the 4-seam at times, but he seems to use it in different spots. I was trying to pick up on signs from the catchers, but those cameras are just not good enough for me to even be able to see the fingers moving, but I was hoping I could tell if he was calling 2 different fastballs. I think he's throwing both. His slider is also a pretty good pitch, and then the changeup looks really good at times. I think he loses it and leaves it up once in a while, but it's got a lot of fade and a lot of depth on it, and he takes off about 10 miles an hour from the fastball. Really just another like starter profile to me, somebody who seems to get what he's doing. He walked a few too many this year, but the stuff is there, and I think the velo is going to keep climbing. When he signed as a 16-year-old, he was reportedly touching 92. Now we're seeing him touch 96. I think he's still got a little bit more in the tank. So those are 2 names I'll be watching pretty closely early on this season. I'm sure you guys will see me tweet about them, or I will talk about them on here at times. But yeah, those are 2 names I'll be watching. And then final thing, just to touch on a guy that I talked about all year, Casey Hunt had a video come out through the place that he trains in the offseason, which is Baseball Performance Center. I'm not sure where they're located, but they put out a lot of good content on social media, Instagram and Twitter, and they show off Hunt a decent amount when he's throwing there. They posted a video this week of him throwing an 82-mile-per-hour knuckleball. Javik Blake, the Biloxi announcer, had found it and posted it, and they replied to him and just made it clear that, this was something that he actually is somewhat comfortable with, but not something that he really added to that repertoire this offseason. But they said on rare occasions it wouldn't be a complete shock to them if he did pull it out and use it. So interesting, always fun. Knuckleballs are just very fun in general. So I'm hoping we at least see him throw it in a random spot once in a while this season. But in reality, the main thing he was working on, and shout out to Jake McKibben from Brewer Fanatic, who actually reached out to them and just kind of interacted with them over social media. But they talked about how he's mainly been working on his changeup, separating the velocity a little bit more from the fastball. Last year, they weren't like 2-3 miles per hour, but it was only 5-6 miles per hour. They're trying to get a little bit more separation between them and then add a little bit more depth to it. On one of the videos that they had posted, you could see the changeup in more of like the 85 range, where it had been more in like the 87 range in season last year, and it did seem to have a little bit more depth. So that will be something that I will be watching with him. And then he also worked on the curveball, which it was inconsistent at times last year. I talked about it on here a couple of times, but it was like the one thing that could get him in trouble is that some starts he would just be leaving the curveball up and it would get hit. So he was working on just finding a little bit more consistency with that. But when it flashed, I mean, it's a really good pitch. The slider is nasty, and it really that pitch was there for him whenever he needed it last year. But I think the curveball was a little bit more inconsistent. So he's trying to sharpen that up and just find it, when he needs it, have it more often than he did last year. So those are all the updates for you. Like I said, I hadn't done many lately because I was doing the 5-part series with Joseph Czar on the entire minor league system. And if you have not watched that, clear your entire weekend because you're going to need a lot of time, but go check it out and just go through. I mean, I think we talked about every returning player to some extent in the entire minor league system. So if you are interested in the deeper parts of the system, you can learn quite a bit from that. And Joseph, I watch quite a few games, but Joseph watches almost every minor league game to some extent for the Brewers. So he had a lot of insight that was really fun too. So now that we're moving forward, like I said, I'll get back into a little bit longer, not this long, probably. Jack's probably going to be mad at me for this, but I'll get a little bit more info than I've been giving the last, I don't know, probably 2 months. And yeah, I'm really looking forward to getting some info from spring training and learning more about these guys. And there's going to be pop-ups. Casey Hunt was barely on my radar at this time last year, and now he's one of my favorite pitching prospects in the organization. So it's always fun to follow this stuff, and hopefully you guys enjoy it when I go through this. I'm sure some of you already turned it off, and I don't blame you one bit, but hopefully those of you who listened do enjoy this stuff.
That brings us to the end of our first spring training episode of the 2025 season. As I mentioned at the start of the program, that means we're going to be back to releasing a new podcast every single week. So Spencer, if you got comfortable with the every other schedule, or every other week schedule, I should say, too bad. We're jumping back on the grind. Brewers baseball is back. I think we're all pretty excited about that. So should be an interesting few weeks to follow the storylines that spring up out of camp. We'll be right here with you at the end of every week to break it all down. Thank you all for listening.